Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Larsens opening, which is pawn here to b3. Nice little subtle move. Again, this is kind of a hyper-modern defense, meaning white's not looking to control the center of the board with his pawns early on. Instead, he's looking to bring his minor pieces, in this case the bishop, from the outside and try to control the center of the board with his minor pieces. So, bishop here to b2. And usually white has a harder time getting his dark square really to put a lot of pressure on the black king. So, you may see something like bishop to, or pawn here to d4, and then the bishop comes out. But this bishop is really, aiming down on this dark, diagonal, or it could always come here to g5, pinning down a knight sometimes that's on f6. But usually black doesn't have to deal with, a bishop here on b2 really dominating this long, dark square diagonal. But that's exactly what white looks to do in this particular opening. And there's about 4 main lines that we're going to be going over today. It's not the most aggressive opening, so if you like kind of a slow, build up a nice attack, find these little small advantages in the opening, this is definitely one that you may want to check out, especially if you're just tired of playing, the e4 or d4. A lot of times black is very, very prepared for that. Not always is prepared for just Larsens opening of pawn here to b3, but gives white so many different options, and it's really hard, in my opinion, to kind of mess this opening up because you're not really committing to anything early on. You're not, putting a lot of pawns forward and saying, okay, what do I do? Do I take a lot? You're really just kind of building up a nice little offense. So we're going to kind of be going over some of the 4 main lines that you will see and kind of talk about some of the theory in this opening. The first variation we're going to be going over is the modern variation, which is e5. And again, within the opening, there's a million different possibilities. We're just going to be going over some of the main lines that are pretty familiar, and even if your opponent hasn't seen the Larsens opening, some of those common things that, okay, it makes a lot of sense. They may play a move like pawn to e5, even if they're not familiar with a lot of the theory. And this move in particular makes a lot of sense because white's really trying to dominate these dark squares, and this pawn here to e5 is kind of counterattacking and trying to control the center of the board with this pawn on e5. White's just going to immediately play bishop here to b2. That's kind of a constant thing with the Larsen after the pawn here to b3, fianchettoing this bishop here to b2, again trying to attack the center of the board. A lot of different ways that black can respond. Obviously his pawn is being attacked, so it could play a very passive move like pawn here to d6, but usually you see something like knight here to c6, developing one of the minor pieces, trying to control, defend kind of this pawn here on e5, and then white can play pawn here to e3. And this pawn here to e3, you're going to see this in all the variations that we go over. White is really looking to, again, control the dark squares, and because of that, he can play a move like pawn here to e3, and then later play a move like pawn here to d4. He can always come with pawn here to f4, again putting a lot of pressure, and he really doesn't have to worry too much about his dark square. Sometimes you may not want to play this pawn here to e3 because then it's going to be harder for your dark square to get out of the pawn chain. But in this particular opening, white doesn't have to worry about that. So he can freely play pawn here to e3 and then later push forward with pawn here to f4 or d4 depending on the situation. Now black has a few options. One option that you may see is just pawn here to d5. Usually when you don't try to attack the center of the board, your opponent will freely do that for you. So pawn here to d5 makes a lot of sense, trying to counterattack, control the center of the board while white tries to control with his minor pieces from the outside. And white from here can just play, bishop here to b5. White's not as concerned with his light square bishop in this game, more concerned with his dark square. So, pinning down this knight here on c6 makes a lot of sense. This is the only defender on this pawn on e5, so if he can kind of take that away, right now this bishop can just come here to e5 and take because the knight can't take away. So black starts to, okay, have to figure out how am I going to now defend this pawn here on, e5. He can now play something like bishop here to d6, which makes sense. Again, getting more minor pieces involved into the game, getting ready to castle on the king side if he wants to, but also adding a defender on this pawn on e5 since his knight's not going to be able to do so. White can now play pawn to f4. And again, this is where white really starts to shine as far as black can make a lot of mistakes here. Black can't really take here with his pawn on f4 because then the bishop can just immediately come in here to g7, and since this dark square bishop on f8 is gone, obviously this rook here on h8 is going to fall. So again, this kind of puts black in a tough spot as far as how is he really going to defend. You know, if he doesn't think about it, he just plays a bad move like knight here to f6. Again, his pawn can just come here, gobble up on e5, and he's going to win one of these pieces right here. This knight here on c6 is still pinned down, so he can't really defend it. This is definitely going to be bad. You could also see something like knight come to e7, getting ready to castle on the king side. But again, pawn here to e5, still going to take. Black can't really recapture because this bishop here on b2 is so problematic. Another move you could see is queen down to h4. Pretty aggressive move from black right now. White can now just play pawn here to g3. White's not really too concerned about castling right now. He can always castle on the queen side if he wants to. He hasn't really committed too many pawns, so he could play something like knight here to c3 later. Easily get his queen involved into the game if he wants to. Castle on the queen side. So this move of pawn to g3, although it kind of commits to not castling on the king side, this is going to be completely fine. If the queen comes back here to something like e7, you know, white can now play knight here to f3. Doesn't want to just take immediately right now with this pawn since black now has two defenders. But a move like knight to f3 adds another attacker on here, so it starts to put more and more pressure on black. So again, these are all going to be very, very good for white. Again, this is in the modern variation. The next variation we're going to look at is the English variation, which is pawn here to c5. Setting up for, you know, pawn here to d6. We have knight here to c6. Black can always then come over to knight to f6 if he wants to. And white has a few different options. He can always play just the bishop here to b2, although against c5 I don't know that it's really the best line that white can take. But two other options that we're going to kind of look at are e4 and the very aggressive f4. So the first one is just e4, which kind of goes against what black is really looking to do, which is dominate the dark squares. But this move of pawn to c5 really just opens up the door for white to go to a normal game of, you know, playing this pawn here to e4, later playing, you know, knight to, you know, f3 right here, bishop here to b2, and kind of have kind of a balanced attack of controlling both the light squares and the dark squares early on. You could see a move like knight to c6, which is pretty common, kind of that Sicilian kind of style defense from here, trying to control from this c file and not really committing anything from the king side. And, you know, from here, white could play bishop here to b2. This kind of gets into it. Black has a few different options. You know, if he plays now knight to f6, you know, white can push forward with pawn to e5. A move, obviously, black's not going to come back here to g8. This would be terrible. You'd lose so much in momentum. Tempo-wise, he can always come here to e4. But this is a little worse as well. Just, you know, white can now play knight to f3. All of his pieces are really, really working well together. This knight on e4 is just really weirdly placed. He could always play something like knight here to d5. You know, white can continue with what he was doing, knight to f3. This is, again, a stable game right here. White definitely has, you know, a small lead. He can always bring his light square, castle on the king side. This is going to be fairly good for white. If we come back here, instead of e4, though, another move I like to play is pawn here to f4. And this is a little bit more aggressive. It really kind of opens up the door for a stronger attack, especially since black is kind of committing to this, you know, queen side attack. This is kind of opening up the door for white to push forward on the king side. So, you know, after a move, you could see knight here to c6. Then you could see knight here to f3. You could see bishop here to b2. You could castle on the king side if you wanted to and kind of have that king's gambit where, you know, this rook is on f1 and it kind of has a semi-open file once this pawn comes off the board. So really aggressive attack, and one benefit that white has is he does have this dark square right here that usually he doesn't have in his attack. So definitely a few different options from white early on. Again, bringing your bishop here to b2, or if you want to control with e4 or f4, you have a lot of different options. The next variation that we're going to look at is the classical variation, and it's pawn here to d5. And this is always a fun game because black says, you know what, I'm going to play my standard opening, I'm going to control the light squares, I'm going to just let you just dominate the dark squares. And so both sides really just get to do what they want to do best, and it's just kind of may the best man win right here. So white's going to continue with bishop here to b2, no reason really to go with anything else right now. You could see something like pawn here to e6, trying to solidify kind of that pawn chain, and then white can play this pawn here to e3. You know, a few different options right here of what he wants to do. But again, this is going to allow him to play, you know, pawn here to f4. He can later play knight here to f3. He's just, again, all these dark squares really dominating, where black really has a lot of different options. He could play, you know, knight here to f6, really control these light squares. He could always, if he wants to, you know, play knight here to c6, pretty common. He can always bring his dark square bishop involved into the game. But again, we kind of block all of those threats off with, you know, pawn here to e3. Another reason why we do that. So, again, the classical variation, you'll see it here and there. And again, you're just going to continue with what you're doing. Control these dark squares. Dominate this long diagonal, and then just continue with your normal development. Again, nothing too crazy, no crazy aggressive lines that you'll see really in this opening, but it's definitely going to be a solid way to open for white. The last variation we're going to look at isn't super common, but it's knight here to f6, kind of that Indian variation style of trying to play a defense with knight to f6, and then something you could play pawn here to g6, fianchetto on the, you know, king side as well. You know, right here, white has a few different options. I think one of the best ones is just here to play, you know, pawn here to d4. I don't think right away playing bishop here to b2 is as strong, just because this long diagonal, you're eventually going to want to get there, but this knight here on f6 immediately kind of shuts down some of your immediate threats. So instead, you can just try to control more of the center of the board with something like pawn here to d4. Later on, you're still going to be playing that bishop here to e3 because your bishop's not coming out here. You're not going to be pinning down this, you know, this knight here from g5. If you did, there's really no reason for even playing this pawn here to b3. You're still going to be playing your bishop here to b2. You know, pawn here to e3. You're still going to be developing your light square out here. Something like c4, nice little outpost, or you could pin down a piece, and then you're going to get your knight involved into the game to f3. It's kind of your standard opening. This just is kind of a stronger attack from what I've seen in my experience from black, kind of shutting down some early threats that black has. Because again, now he can fianchetto himself. He can play, you know, pawn here to g6, fianchetto to f7, castle on the king side. And again, it kind of goes into that middle game. Both sides are going to be somewhat equal in the game. So again, this is the Larsens opening. It can kind of throw your opponent off if they're not too familiar with it. So if you want to try something new, give it a go, especially if you're having a hard time getting your dark square bishop involved into the game, especially on this long dark diagonal. Late in the game, it can definitely give your opponent some problems. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully y'all got some of the themes that you should be thinking about in this opening. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.